All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ed Bula, lead consultant at Two Circles, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Future of Sports Fandom, a Two Circles study and presentation. We really appreciate you being with us today. We're going to get started in just a few minutes when I hand you over to my colleagues Sam and Laura, who will be guiding you through our insights today on generational relationships and attitudes towards sports. Before that, I'm going to quickly signpost you a few things about the platform we're using today. In the top right of your screen, you should see a chat bar, polls function, and questions function. Please use the chat bar if you want to say hello to the group or flag any technical issues you are having. If that does happen, we'll try to help you as soon as possible. In about 10 minutes or so, we'll be running a poll to the room, so look out for that, and you'll want to use your poll function when that time comes. Finally, we encourage you to use the questions function throughout the presentation, as we have kept some time later on for a Q&A. So please, as we go through the presentation, note down, submit your questions, and we'll get to as many as possible before we say goodbye and see you next time today. Finally, you'll note in the top right corner as well, a bell icon. That'll enable you to mute the sound of any notifications coming through, which you might find helpful. So you'll see me a few more times in the next hour, but until then, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues Sam and Laura, who are going to quickly introduce Two Circles before presenting our insights and analysis into the future of sports fandom. Enjoy.
Thanks, Ed. Thank you all for coming. Delighted to have you here. Welcome to the kitchen. It's got the best internet connection in this building. Delighted to have you here today, and I hope you find this interesting and a stimulating hour of your time. I'm Sam Yardley. I lead the Two Circles North America business. A bit of background about me: I was a management consultant in a previous life. I joined Two Circles about 8 years ago and worked for our UK team for the first 6 years before moving out to lead our North America business a couple of years ago. And my colleague Laura is going to be co-presenting with me today.
Thanks, Sam. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm Laura Andriani, VP of Consulting at Two Circles. My background is in digital marketing, and for the past decade, I've worked in sports media, previously at ESPN and DAZN, mostly focused on audience development and engagement marketing within the web, apps, and OTT spaces.
Cool. I'm going to start off by giving a bit of a background about Two Circles first. We provide a real range of services for sports properties. That's everything from managing their data and implementing technology on their behalf, through to strategic consulting, helping them grow their businesses and grow engagement with audiences. We do a lot of execution work on the digital marketing front. That's campaigns across multiple channels. And we also manage rights, where we represent our clients in the market on behalf of them. All of this really falls under the banner of growing direct relationships between sports and fans. And the reason why we think that is important is because sports is moving from the analog era into the digital age, and direct relationships between fans and the properties they love is going to be the currency. It already is the currency of the way in which the sports marketplace is evolving. Our client roster is equally broad. So we work with everybody from individual teams right through to some of the biggest global leagues. And we think that gives us a unique perspective. We back that with us managing more data than any other sports property in the world, sports business in the world. We think we manage 850 million distinct data records every year on behalf of our clients, which gives us a great understanding of what sports fans are doing. So when we look at that data in an anonymous way, we're able to analyze behaviors, patterns of transactions, attitudes towards different sports and different properties. We also augment that with research. So a large focus of today's presentation is going to be around a specific piece of research we did into a topic that we know is of utmost importance to sports, and that's generational fandom, and how we can incubate the next generation of sports fandom to engage with our properties and to continue to grow this business that we all love. What we know from that research and from our time in business is that sports fandom is incredibly complex, and it's increasingly so. And that is happening at an accelerated rate. So the last 12 months or so, the sports industry, like every other industry in the world, has been through unprecedented upheaval. Andrew Yang, at the beginning of the COVID crisis, said that we're going through 10 years of change in just 10 weeks. And that's borne out whether you look at media consumption preferences, whether you look at e-commerce rates, whether you look at any number of businesses that have been through unprecedented disruption. Sports is no different. And I would argue that this is the era of most rapid change in sports that we've ever seen. So we've seen those accelerated media trends around cord cutting, movement to OTT, different properties emerging. We've seen new sports properties, new sports rights owners come to market. So Overtime has reinvented itself as a basketball league. Triller has emerged as a boxing promoter. The European Super League had a brief moment in the sun last week. Thankfully, it's gone away. There's been new forms of financing as well. So barely a week goes past without a new SPAC coming out. 10 years of change in just 10 weeks, I think, is the mantra that the sports industry has to adopt, because we're going through unprecedented change at an unprecedented rate, and that has continued through the pandemic. So the industry is changing, but what we want to do today is unpack some of the how and some of the why. So with our research, we started with the broadest possible base, which is the population of the US. So there's 328 million individuals in the US, each represented by a stick person here. Of those, we think that 134 million, roughly 40%, are sports fans. And our research focused a lot around the generational divides and differences between sports fandom across generations. So the language we're using today is the language of these generations. So boomers, that is people born between 1946 and 1964. Gen X, between 65 and 1980. Millennials are those who are born between 1981 and 1995, and Gen Z, who are born 1996 onwards. You'll see here that we think there are more millennials and more Gen Z sports fans than boomers and Gen X. Part of that is a function of population growth, but part of it is also relative. So we think that as a proportion of the overall population in those generations, there are more sports fans amongst millennials and Gen Z than there are boomers and Gen X, which is contrary to a lot of the received wisdom in the industry today. But we'll talk about later on how that fandom differs from what we might term traditional sports fandom in the older generations. What's also really interesting is that the sports industry, by our estimates in the US, is worth about $55 billion a year. But we think that around $20 billion is driven by just 5% of the population. So 36% of the industry's value comes from 1/20th of the population of the US. And that's typically male, typically older than 40, and typically higher affluence. The sports industry today and the commercial models that exist today are reliant on the few and not the many. We think there is a huge opportunity for sports to broaden out and to reach the many. So you look at breakdowns by racial diversity, by gender diversity across these generations. These bar charts show some of the opportunity that exists. So the percentage of non-whites in the US that are interested in sports by generation is much higher amongst Gen Zs than the older generations, including millennials. And in gender diversity, the percentage of females who are very interested in sports is also higher amongst younger generations. So the racial diversity of our audience and the gender diversity of our audience will increase over time. It has already increased, but the models that the sports industry has used to commercialize itself have not changed, or have barely changed over the last 20 years or so. Everything we see in the market points towards a seismic shift where an industry that has grown up around TV models and TV distribution, and us all evaluating how successful events are on TV metrics alone, has been built to service the few and not the many. And a lot of the properties that are gaining traction, a lot of the properties that are gaining attention these days are built and wired fundamentally differently to appeal to younger generations and to grow fandom, where a lot of incumbents and a lot of traditional sports properties have really struggled. So as we play through these generational divides over time, that's only going to get more acute and become more pronounced. And so the battle lines have kind of been drawn here. There's a tension between balancing what's traditional and what's new. for a lot of more traditional properties, that's something incredibly uncomfortable. Between maintaining TV rights fees and growing them, as the NHL demonstrated this week, sports rights fees can continue to grow, and that's great for our business. But also, how do we grow other forms of media and make sure those two can complement versus compete with each other? To address the balance between the physical and the digital ways of experiencing sports and commerce in sports. How do organizations move from a traditionally B2B model of monetization towards acting and behaving like D2C businesses, like all sports properties need to, in our view? To manage the voices of the institution and the individuals in a world in which individuals, as we'll come to talk about, have more clout than they've ever had before. And to trade off between what's official and what's organic, or what's more authentic as a tone of voice for an organization. It's a fascinating area to explore. I'm going to hand back to Ed now, who's going to run a quick poll. So over to you, Ed, and we're going to use the poll functionality here.
Thank you, Sam. Yep, that's right. We're going to run a very quick poll, so we please ask that you flip to that channel. And we hope there'll be benefit for everyone in this, and that anyone who votes in the poll will be able to see the overall results. And the question we would like to pose to you is the following. How confident are you in your organization's ability to attract younger audiences? And your choices are not at all, we're just starting out, it's under control, or nailed it. That's the question. Those are the choices. We'll give everyone 30 seconds to think and vote. And Sam, when you're ready, I'll let you have a peek of the results and keep us going. Thank you all for voting.
This is what's known in research as confirmation bias, by the way. So if you join the session to find out more about younger generations in sports, you probably don't have it nailed, but there are a few of you that have nailed it. So it's great to see. I think a lot of you guys just starting out, looks like 63% so far just starting out on this journey. A few of you had it under control. It's good to know. Love to be able to delve in to find out who has it under control and who doesn't. But thank you for participating in that poll. Hopefully today's session will get you further along that journey. And Laura is going to come back in a second once we talk about some of the research headlines that we uncovered. So 5 key insights from our research, and hopefully you can see these. The first is that sports fandom, we believe, is made at a very young age. That's no surprise, but the age which we've identified is 14, by which half of sports fandom has been ignited. So that makes the current battleground for attention those people who are younger than the first iPhone. Second trend that we pulled out is being an inch deep and mile wide. So I alluded to earlier on how fandom is fundamentally different in younger generations. We believe that sports is as relevant as it's ever been, but that attention that younger fans have for sports is spread much more widely than it's ever been before. We think that younger sports fans have broader horizons. So they're much more likely to follow international teams and leagues and athletes than necessarily being so rooted to local and so rooted to the traditional big 4 sports leagues in the US. We believe they engage everywhere. So they watch, follow, and participate with sports through a vast multitude of touch points and have many more entry points into sports that they love. And then lastly, we believe this change, and we believe that fandom will be led by individuals. So people are much more likely in younger generations to identify with, follow, and be influenced by individuals. That's not just athletes, but it is individuals, rather than necessarily teams they play for or events they compete in. So Laura's going to come back in now and talk about the first trend, which is made by 14.
Thank you, Sam. Much of how we develop as adults is influenced by our childhood, and sports is no different. Tim Ellis, who's the NFL's chief marketing officer, said last year that the league's own data bears this out. His exact words were, "There's no strategy for bringing in a 35-year-old fan for the first time. You have to make them a fan by the time they're 18, or you'll lose them forever." We actually think the age barrier sports needs to focus on is even lower. Research from the music industry recently found that the songs we listened to during our teen years set our musical taste as adults. For most men, the most important period for forming musical taste is between the ages of 13 to 16. Men were on average age 14 when their favorite song was released, while women, for the most important period, was even younger, between 11 and 14, with 13 being the most likely age for when their favorite song came out. Once men and women reached their early 20s, according to the research, new songs were only half as influential. Entering into adulthood, the choices people made only reinforced their musical biases formed during their teens. As an adult who recently took up the drums, as you can see in my background, I definitely agree, as the songs I most enjoy playing are the ones from my teen years. Our data shows a similar trend for sports. Our relationship with the sports, teams, events, and athletes we follow are formed by the age of 20. Our research has found that cross-generation, there's a critical window between the ages of 6 and 20 when someone becomes a sports fan, and 50% of sports fandom is set by the age of 14. And when we drill into specific sports, the trend line is quite similar, but the steeper increases happen earlier for some sports fans than others. For example, we see that 50% of sports fans fandom, baseball fans fandom, was set by the age of 10, whereas golf hits its critical growth trajectory when fans are past the age of 20. In order to understand the reason for this difference, we need to consider several factors. But the truth, as we all know, is that sports fandom is complex. There is no one eureka moment when someone becomes a sports fan as a child. Rather, it's a combination of things. For one, family upbringing, inheriting habits of your parents and other family members. Peer influence plays a part as well. That is, developing a shared interest with friends in or out of school at an impressionable age. A third factor is participation in sports as a child and how that drives interest in professional athletes, teams, and events. We saw previously that baseball sports fandom is started the youngest. It's estimated that more than 3 million kids play Little League in the US. In fact, Little League is the largest organized youth sports program in the world and operates approximately 6,500 leagues in the country. And a fourth important factor, media coverage, enticing interest through live sports and or regular exposure to the soap opera around sports. So how have we seen this done well? Well, many sports properties focus their resources, as Sam mentioned, influencing and commercializing existing fans who have a disposable income and are able to transact. Focusing on influencing behavior in teens could well be a more strategic place to focus. Finding ways to engage with potential fans when they're young is fundamental, and participation pathways is one way of doing so. As we saw earlier, 4 sports, football, soccer, basketball, and baseball, saw a third of their fans become a fan before the age of 10. And several sports properties have been active across the states, using their IP to host inclusive kids camps across the country. The MLB in particular have done a really great job in participating and promoting the Boys and Girls Club of America for the past 25 years, investing their resources in initiatives that support youth participation in baseball and softball in underserved communities through after-school programs, as well as virtual support programs during the past year in response to COVID. If anyone saw the wildcard matchup between the Bears and the Saints back in January that was broadcast on Nickelodeon, you're probably familiar with how innovative and fun watching a football game with team sideline reporters, SpongeBob cameos, and an abundance of Nick's signature green slime being shot into the end zone after a touchdown can be. That silly and honestly really refreshing take was a welcome one in so many households, and it secured a ton of social chatter. It also helped that kickoff was at 4:40 Eastern, a really family-friendly time. And we'd be remiss if we didn't include the cross-pollination of one Gen Z interest into another. Fortnite did this really well earlier this year, introducing their kickoff set, which allowed fans to play the game while wearing their favorite soccer team's kits. And the options weren't just restricted to one league. The 23 clubs available ranged from local favorites like the Sounders and LAFC to clubs across the globe, including Man City, Juventus, and Santos. This approach to attracting often hard-to-target consumers of exposing casual and avid gamers alike to an array of cool clubs is really smart. It's bringing a club's colors and crest to a new setting that's accessible, also known as free, and captivating. Couple this creative mashup with an astounding 350 million registered Fortnite players. That's right. 68% of whom are reportedly millennials or Gen Zers, and you have a great opportunity to reach new fans in new places at scale. I'll hand it back over to you, Sam.
Thanks, Laura. Hey, I'm back, I think. Second trend we wanted to unpack is that of inch-deep and mile-wide fandom. So sports has as much relevance here as it's ever had before, if not more so. But these younger fans are spreading their attention much more thinly. So if we look at this next chart, what we have here is the number of interests. So this is broader than just sports. The average number of interests, be that film, television, health and fitness, food and drink. The average number of interests grows substantially as you get down the younger generations. So there's more competition for attention generally. There's also more competition for attention within sports. So if you look at the average number of sports that people are interested in, Gen Zers are interested in twice as many sports as boomers. So there's more competition from outside of sports and there's more competition from within sports for these younger fans' attention. And we believe that exposure to content has created a generation with shallower fandom. So the number of people who say they're sports fans is increasing, as you can see here. The highlighted bars show that Gen Zers 31% say they're sports fans, boomers 22%. So there are more sports fans, but there is also more competition, as you can see from the shaded bars where people are suggesting a strong interest. Over 40% of people interested in these things. Gen Zers have 4 of those interests. Now, it may be that this changes over time. We just don't know for sure yet. But if you're thinking that this is just going to return to normal and that as Gen Zers get older, as millennials get older, they'll start to become more like boomers and Gen Xers, we have no guarantee of that either. What I can assure you is there'll be more content available, not less. More distractions there, not less. And more competition in the future, not less. So if I was going to bet on anything, I'd bet on change, and this being the new normal versus being a reversion to type. So some examples here to draw out some of the things that we think are important in terms of how properties respond. So we think that properties need to bet on a shallower relationship with fans and therefore have an active strategy for engaging passive fans to be able to cross-pollinate across different interest sets. So it's no longer sufficient just to put content on social media and cross fingers, but organizations that can really understand what content is going to resonate with which audiences and why they're doing these things is really critical. And a data-driven understanding of that will always help. So some examples here that we've called out. The first one on the left is a collaboration between Louis Vuitton and League of Legends. Those are not phrases that I would have assumed to say in the same sentence a few years ago, but here we are. League of Legends has released some Louis Vuitton skins, so you could buy these skins for your players in the game at $10 a piece. And then subsequently, Louis Vuitton were able to release a real-life collection based upon the same designs in the games. This is kind of a natural extension, although it sounds kind of strange from the outside. It's a real natural extension of what has happened historically between different forms of entertainment in terms of how to cross-pollinate and how to product placement effectively between different forms of media. The second example here is a documentary called Rising Phoenix, which debuted around the time of the Tokyo Paralympics, as was originally scheduled last year. And this is a really powerful series to bring those stories. Some of the most powerful stories we have in sports are those of Paralympic athletes, to bring those stories and those athletes to the masses, where Paralympic sports hasn't obviously had the same profile as other forms of sports. And it's been a really successful series to bring those stories to life and bring those athletes to the forefront for more passive audiences. And then lastly, Triller won't have escaped anybody's attention over the last couple of weeks. Wonderful hype fest that Triller is. I don't know how many people actually saw the boxing event that it was. Really kind of more of a music festival combined with a sports event. reinventing the way in which sports can be delivered for younger audiences. So digital first, blending these forms of entertainment together, lots of celebrities, lots of hype, and delivered in a way that's quite captivating, quite compelling for younger audiences, without a lot of the hang-ups and the challenges that incumbency brings to the sports industry. And it's kind of Hollywood as much as sports. And as many of us find that potentially quite jarring, coming from more of a traditional sports property background, it is breaking through, and it's putting boxing on the map in particular. I'll hand back over to Laura to talk about how this type of thing is already showing up in sports fandom and the numbers that we're seeing.
Thank you, Sam. So the third insight we want to share focuses on the multi-dimensional set of both local and global sports and how their strategic approach to building Gen Z fandom differs. Today's youth is just as likely to follow international teams and leagues and domestic properties and athletes outside of the major league establishment. So are we seeing a changing of the guard? What our research showed was that unlike their predecessors, Gen Z's interest when it comes to sports is much more varied. While football and basketball still dominate in their Gen Z fandom, the disparity between them and other previously considered challenger sports is shrinking. As has already been established, Gen Z sporting interests are shallower and more widespread. There are new properties in town and they're battling for attention. These challenger sports, soccer and boxing, fall into third and fourth place respectively in terms of Gen Z popularity, are well positioned and often leading the way in experimenting with new approaches to reaching their fans. In doing so, they're igniting a lifelong fandom with the youngest generation. It should be noted as well, though not shown on the chart, that MMA is also the 6th most popular sport for Gen Z. For boomers, it's 12th in line. There's also compelling data that suggests that the traditional hook of being a local team or sport is waning among Gen Zers, and that interest in global properties is very much on the rise. According to our data, 63% of boomer fans follow their local or hometown team, but this figure falls with every generation down to 30% for Gen Z. Meanwhile, 31% of Gen Z sports fans are very interested in international professional sports leagues, the highest of the 4 generations and far greater than boomers at only 6%. But being local doesn't mean you can't thrive or that the opportunities to build loyalty among younger audiences are dried up. As Sam spoke about earlier when he talked about the battle lines being drawn, there is an opportunity for all, as long as those established old guard properties innovate and experiment, taking cues from the challengers who are quickly growing in popularity. So while local teams may not benefit from the mass scale of fandom, they can attract younger audiences by embracing innovation and building upon what they know to be true, that roots matter and that local pride is a cornerstone of team fandom. FC Cincinnati is a great example of a team that has been very locally relevant, building a brand that's tied to the community with lots of grassroots and supporter club type initiatives. Heavily discounted ticket campaigns, special sections intended for families, and community programs are ways of staying approachable and attractive. But what about tapping into Gen Z specifically? Well, in recent news, the club has re-signed its champion gamer to their MLS team. Fiddle, as he's called, is elevating FC Cincinnati's profile among gamers and is representing the US in the larger global FIFA E-Nations Cup competitions this year. This is a great opportunity for the club to promote its brand outside the city limits and even abroad. On the flip side, you have global powerhouses like the Premier League. While they will continue to have their local supporters for years to come, they've captured American hearts, and young ones at that, through local US City fan activations, by promoting their fantasy games to new fans, and by investing in the Saturday morning broadcast ritual. The new guard can continue what they're doing. The Drone Racing League is a sport that combines the thrill of Star Wars pod racing with real-life adrenaline of Formula One and wingsuit flying. It's a video game turned into real life, rather than the other way around, and designed for Gen Z. On the broadcast coverage, it's sometimes hard to distinguish whether it's real or CGI. but they also race in venues known to sports fans around the world, such as the Hard Rock Stadium, which is a regular stop on the tour. That's deliberate. Why do sports created today need to look like anything in the past? The DRL also has a similar league, the DRL Tryouts, that enables amateurs a pathway to professionalism, allowing drivers to go from the simulator to the main event in just a couple of weeks. And likewise, the old guard need to act more like the new guard, as exemplified by the NBA. In one case, the league took the rule book and flipped it for the All-Star game. For the second year in a row, rule changes helped bolster anticipation and excitement. Fans were acutely interested in watching the entire game to see who won each quarter, as the cumulative score from those 3 quarters dictated the final score needed to win the game in the untimed 4th quarter. This example proved that the establishment, so to speak, can learn from younger challenger properties. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Sam.
Thanks, Laura. So trend 4 that we pulled out, engaging everywhere. This is the idea that younger sports fans are watching, following, and participating across a vast multitude of touch points, much more so than older generations. Now, a lot's been made of the decline of live. And what we've got here is a graph that I think holds that in check somewhat. So here, live games, this is the percentage of sports fans that are interested in watching different forms of content. Live games in blue, clips and highlights in orange, and social content in yellow. So live is declining amongst younger generations. That's probably no surprise, but it's not exactly a cliff edge. And clips and highlights maintains kind of this even keel. What's interesting though is that social content grows sharply between boomers and millennials, and then kind of plateaus for Gen Zers. The implication of this is there's no winner takes all strategy. It's not like content needs to live on one platform. If anything, it's the reverse. It's a hybrid media approach that's required. Gen Z in particular have multiple different entry points for sports. So this next slide looks at Gen Z in blue and all older generations grouped together for simplicity in grey. What this bar chart shows is that the percentage of people in Gen Z that play sports is much higher than older generations, that play sports video games is much higher than older generations, and that follow esports is much higher. What's also interesting though is that betting and fantasy aren't particular gateways for Gen Zers. We find them to be more around engaging a passive audience or a more casual audience across multiple generations versus being Gen Z targeted schemes. We know that young fans won't necessarily sit through 3-hour games every night, but they will consume content on shorter forms or shorter media forms of content on a variety of platforms. And that's why this hybrid media strategy idea is really relevant. So some examples here to draw this to life. Platform-specific content. The NBA have done a great job on TikTok in particular. I'd encourage you all to hunt out the Dwight Howard video we're showing here. It's a very entertaining watch. Being really deliberate about what you're using each platform for versus just treating social or treating media as one broad bucket. The RNA, who run the Open Golf Championship, have taken a different approach, and they've decided to syndicate content more widely during the tournament window across multiple third-party media channels. So they develop leaderboards and clip rights that they can distribute to third-party media platforms to ultimately grow the reach of their owned media platforms during the tournament. As we move into this world of fragmented attention and multiple touch points, it becomes more important than ever to be able to manage interactions and manage customer journeys in near real time. And that's what Wimbledon are doing a great job of. Lots of other organizations in the sports marketplace are doing a great job of, is using data and using technology to join the dots between all these different interactions. Because ultimately, if you don't measure it and you don't manage it, then nothing different can happen. You're just kind of spreading content far and wide. So real-time interaction management, I think, is going to become one of the big trends over the next few years in sports, as it already has emerged in wider D2C businesses. Also, just wanted to touch upon Formula One as a really interesting case study that I think joins a lot of these dots together. So Formula One historically was not necessarily a mass market sport. It had a really narrow audience set of people that knew the sport inside out and loved it. But as the new ownership, Liberty Media, came on board, they decided to reinvent that, and ultimately ended up tweaking the sports format, but that wasn't where they started. They started with an initiative to broaden the appeal of the sport. And that resulted in the Netflix documentary that I'm sure a lot of you know, Drive to Survive, which takes people behind the scenes and tells them the stories of Formula One and not just the racing. They reinvented their digital and social media approach, brought that into the 21st century, whereas under previous ownership it was not the case. They developed properties and ways in for younger audiences to get a bigger piece of that attention pie. So esports and fantasy, driving at both new audiences, younger audiences, and engaging people who might have had more of a passive affinity for the sports. And then on the right-hand side, what you can see here is Fan Voice and F1 TV, which are much more directed at existing avid fans. So Fan Voice is a feedback mechanism between the sport and its fans. And F1 TV is a new OTT platform with a kind of 2.0 streaming experience versus 1.0 streaming experience, just replicating the linear broadcast. This has lots more data and lots more ways for real avid fans to consume the sport they love. But the format tweak that's come out this week, I think, is really interesting, because that is designed to take attention and broaden it and appeal to more people and to get more people watching for longer periods over the weekend. So they've just announced that 3 races this year are going to have a new format with a sprint race on the Saturday, which is very, very different to what had traditionally been happening with just the long form race on the Sunday. So Formula One is a really interesting kind of traditional property that has evolved and will continue to evolve to appeal to a wider audience. And at this point, I'm going to hand back to Laura, who's going to talk us through the final trend.
Thanks, Sam. So the final insight we wanted to dive into today goes back to those battle lines being drawn. That is individual versus team sport. Sports fans are more likely to identify with, follow, and be influenced by athletes rather than the teams they play for or the events they compete in. Traditionally, team sports fandom has primarily revolved around a relationship with the team itself. Though clearly every generation has had a group of athletes whose profile and performances transcend their employers. However, the bond between fan and team is weaker with Gen Z. Gen Z have grown up with social media, where human stories and lives told directly to them from the mouths of the athletes themselves is inherently more interesting than those of the teams. Gen Z sports fans have therefore developed to identify with the athletes themselves more than older generations, and are more likely to root for the person, no matter the team. According to our research, compared to older generations, Gen Z sports fans have a far stronger interest in individual sports. There are 2 points to call out here. Number 1, for Gen Z, 5 out of the top 10 most popular sports are individual ones, whereas that number is lower at 4 for older generations. Number 2, Gen Z's interest in individual sports is almost double what it is for older generations. Why do we think this is? Well, let's take boxing, for example. For a fan, boxing requires a small investment of time. 1 night, 1 fight card. Not a season's worth of matchups or long played out playoffs. And even if it's not free to watch, it's often a one-time investment. What's more, boxing's lack of established governance and institution makes way for more innovative formats and individual-led storylines, coupled with the ready-made conflict narrative. There are many reasons why YouTube superstars turned boxers like Jake Paul have found incredible success in the boxing ring, and these may be a few of them. We also see this play out in who younger sports fans follow. According to our data, 1/3 of Gen Z and millennial sports fans say they follow players versus 1/4 of boomers. The individuals on the right are an obvious example, but it holds up the majority of the time. people are more popular than things, and that gap is growing. Athletes have been able to use social media to create their own individual brands that can reach audiences directly. This has helped create a new crop of contemporary role models who are inspirational yet relatable and who share a common bond, interest, or philosophy with their followers. As we all know, this was brought to the forefront last year following the death of George Floyd, where athletes from every sport, such as LeBron James, Drew Holiday, Natasha Cloud, Naomi Osaka, were intent on using their sport and their platform to call for social change. Today, kids are following athletes first, then they're following clubs, and then they're following the leagues because they want that one-on-one connection with the athletes they admire. This puts sports properties into a relatively new position where their biggest talent can hold greater influence and have a wider following than themselves. Sports properties, teams, leagues, and events in particular need to understand how best to work with athlete talent. For some properties, having individual voices become stewards for their brand is a really big mindset shift. And while it may at first seem so, these individual voices shouldn't be seen as a threat or a roadblock, but rather a strength and an opportunity. For many, understanding how best to identify who the new faces of a sport are and work closely with them on a shared goal is a critical first step. Developing their profile alongside the profile of the sport, team, or league they're involved in then follows suit. The UFC is doing this in several ways. For example, they've grown their YouTube channel to 11.5 million subscribers, not just through live streams, but shoulder content that does include the usual suspects, highlights, and interviews, but they mix it in with first-person narrative vlogs like the series Embedded, which are wildly popular. And just last week, UFC announced a partnership with Tagboard, a company poised to help them integrate interactive original TikTok content into its live broadcasts. Working alongside tech companies to push those boundaries of storytelling is clearly a very integral part of their strategic approach to building younger fandom. We've also seen sports properties actively support and reward athlete engagement with the property and the sport itself. Recently, the PGA Tour launched its Player Impact Program to incentivize individual players financially to add to the tour's overall product. In the PGA's words, it wanted to recognize and reward players who positively move the needle. In doing so, the PGA Tour is providing extra resources to help all players manage their social media and branding, including charitable foundations, and to maximize their off-course business opportunities. The tour said several metrics will determine a player's impact score, which will then determine who receives the financial compensation. Some of the contributing calculations include their popularity in Google searches, their Nielsen brand exposure rating, the MVP index rating, and their meltwater mentions, which measures the frequency that a player generates coverage across various media platforms. The PGA Tour recognizes players and their influence, and in encouraging and supporting them to impact their audience, they realize they can bolster their own brand. And with that, I will pass it back over to Sam.
Cool, thanks, Laura. So just to kind of wrap things up in this section, what we wanted to do here was really kind of draw out some of the implications we think for properties from these trends that we've seen in younger audiences. So made by 14, the implication here is being able to place a greater focus on driving relationships with younger fans from those young ages with the sports that they love, leaning into participation pathways and partnerships to cement those bonds. For inch-deep, mile-wide fans, the implication here is to bet on those shallow relationships, to look for opportunities to cross-pollinate between different interest sets and develop active strategies to reach passive fans. With those broader horizons that these younger fans have, understanding your property's USPs and building that into storytelling, finding your own balance between what's local, what's global, and what opportunities you can find to extend or tweak formats to have that broader appeal. For engaging everywhere, we think the appropriate response is a hybrid media model, the one that's flexed by platform, extended by syndication where possible, to take advantage of multiple entry points that these younger fans have into sports, and to ultimately develop that fan avidity and that journey that we showed with F1, managing those relationships with data and technology in real time. And then lastly, as this change is led by individuals, as properties, we think the right response is to identify those faces, identify the human interest stories that are part of your sports and part of your properties. That can be athletes and other individuals. What are the conflict narratives? What are the stories that are there that are going to stand the test of time? And work with those individuals to develop those stories and reward success. So we've heard a lot today about fans and how behaviour is changing, and a few tactical examples from where we've seen sports properties respond. In closing, before we get to the Q&A section, I just wanted to kind of bring this up a level and talk about some big strategic themes that we think are the right direction of travel for properties who are looking to respond to these changes. The first is to have purpose and relevance. So younger generations, millennials and Gen Zers, much more interested in equality, socially conscious, and that transcends the commercial model of sports. So a great example here is Angel City SC, which is a National Women's Soccer League expansion team. What they've done with their partnership model is amazing. So they do encourage that every single partner that comes on board with them donates money to a local cause, and DoorDash donated $1 million of its partnership fee to supporting food inequality or combating food inequality in Los Angeles, which is a wonderful story. And they stand for something, and that transcends all of their media and all their marketing efforts. The second is storytelling brilliance. Narratives are at the heart of sport. It's why we all watch. It's why we all love the sports that we love. And unpredictability is sports USP versus other forms of narrative. So being able to tell those stories, those individual stories, those combat stories, as brilliantly and as true to brand identity as possible, and to importantly use data to iterate that storytelling and audience understanding is going to position properties best for the future. And then last but not least, data and direct relationships. We believe that every single sports property has to begin acting like a D2C business and not like a B2B business. And that means knowing customers inside out. That means managing and collecting first-party data better than ever, and providing digital experiences that transcend consumer behavior trends that we see today. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand back to Ed, who's going to lead us through questions. I'm going to stay on the virtual stage. I think Laura's going to come back up here as well. Ed, what questions do we have?
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, we've gotten a good couple interesting and relevant questions. So let the fun begin. The first question I'll ask is, with new fans spreading their fandom and sports consumption across more properties, does that impact their affinity to each team and athlete they follow? So touching a bit on our inch deep, a mile wide, but what does that mean when they do express an interest or a team or an athlete, considering there might be a broader set? What does that mean for their interest and their following of those teams and athletes?
Yeah, I can have a first stab at this one. I think for me, fundamentally, what sports properties need to do is think about the volume of fan relationships they have. So the number of people that care about the sport, and then the degree to which they care, which is the avidity angle. And I think if you're able to know that the number of fans that you can measure and you can touch is growing, and the degree to which they care is growing, then ultimately you are future-proof. Now that's kind of very theoretical. I think attention is by and large fixed. There's only a certain amount of hours in the day you can be consuming content. So there is a degree to which there is a displacement effect happening in younger generations, where if they, 24 hours of the day spread over 8 different properties or 8 different leagues, can only yield so many hours of attention for any one team. So I think it is impacting that. But I think as long as you have, number of fans going up and avidity stable or going up, then you'll be in a good shape for years to come. Laura, anything to add?
I think those are really good points. The only thing I would add is I think the players in this space that are doing this really well are playing in the spaces where they know they can add value, and not just kind of being in a space without the proper strategy or being there just because they think that's the right place to be. So when you think about Red Bull, when you think about the WSL, those are properties that are creating content for the right audiences in the right spheres, whether that's short form, whether that's long form, whether it's for avid fans, whether it's for casual fans. So yeah, that's the piece that I think is also really important to think about.
Nice, thank you both. Okay, next question actually sent to us by Twitter. So yeah, a little shameless plug for our Twitter account there. The question is
Twitter or from Twitter. Is it Jack Dorsey?
It's the Twitter account. The question is, you said that live is still important to Gen Z, but we saw viewing figures drop significantly for this year's Super Bowl and Oscars. Is that COVID's measurement nuances related to those two specific events?
Yeah, I can go with this one. I think COVID is definitely a large part of it. I think measurement's a large part of it. And the Oscars, I think, has been more badly affected by COVID than Super Bowl was, in terms of people not being able to get to the cinema, get to the movies as much as they would have otherwise done, and then that having a kind of corresponding decline in terms of the attention focused on the Oscars. Measurement, I think, plays a big role as well, in that I don't think we're adequately measuring total consumption. You know, there's efforts to measure digital consumption, digital streaming a lot better than historically, but total consumption is much, much broader than that. And, you know, some of the platforms involved, including Netflix, aren't really that measurable to the outside industry. So I think COVID and measurement are definitely contributing factors. I would say, though, those trends probably aren't going to revert to normal post-COVID because of everything that we've been talking about, and how younger generations are turning off from live, not maybe in as stark a numbers as some outlets are reporting, but are turning away from it a little bit. So I think it's probably going to be more of the same versus a reversion to normal.
Nice, thank you, Sam. Another question has just come through related to our third insight about broader horizons. The question is, localization has been a big trend in marketing over the last few years. So curious of what has driven younger generations' is more global viewpoint, and how that impacts locally bound teams. Sure, a question lots of our team and kind of as this person has put it, locally bound organizations are wrestling with.
Laura, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, sure. So I think that there's a lot to dig into here, but when we think about those earlier slides that Sam showed of the growth of Gen Z, a lot of that is happening in urban areas. So you have this natural proliferation of so many different cultures kind of growing up together. And I think that ignites a normal kind of curiosity that spans outside of, just your home. And I think that translates into the interests that you have and the sports interests that you have. So I think that, the example we showed earlier of local football clubs, like there's so much to dive into there in terms of what their fan base looks like, what cultures they represent, and the types of people that want to be spoken to and the stories they want to hear. So I think that there's a lot at play, and I think that the ones that are doing it right are really asking the first question of, who is it that is consuming our sport or coming to our games, and what are the things that ignite those passions, and why should we be telling those stories? So we could probably have a whole other separate digital event about that one alone.
Thank you, Laura. Sam, anything you'd add there?
Not really. I think it's just a function of, the platforms where a lot of younger people are getting their content from is algorithm dependent, and it has an inbuilt tendency to promote the biggest things, which is why, you're probably more likely to see a post from LeBron than most other athletes in the NBA. So I think there is a degree to which just media consumption forces the way media consumption is right now forces the big to get bigger, which does have an impact on local, because most media platforms today are global. So I think that's probably an inherent tendency of the way in which media consumption is built today.
Very good, thank you. Okay, I think we'll wrap up with this one. It's a great question that we get posed quite often in our day-to-day. What is your recommendation for conveying to senior leadership the importance of investing towards reaching and engaging new and younger audiences when the majority of immediate revenues are still coming from more mature areas, TV broadcast, season tickets, etc.?
I can take a first swing at this one. This is a brilliant question. So I think generally my observation is senior leadership tends to be more financially focused than other parts of the organization. And so therefore you need to kind of couch this in financial terms. And the ways in which I tend to do that is looking at lifetime value. So looking at, right, we have this audience segment that's very, very lucrative for us now, but will not be able to be lucrative for us in 20, 30 years time, because comes a time where you stop going to games. So building a lifetime value model to show that, right, we have this younger audience that we need to build into that over time, and what that investment and payback period will look like. I think that has to be at the fundamentals of it. You don't tend to win those sorts of debates with purely rational discussions though. So the emotional side of it, I think, has to play on either hope or doom, depending on how the senior executives are wired. You can create a narrative that's very like, we are running towards a cliff edge here and we're going to drop off unless we do something different. Or one of, this is what, this is the right way to move. This is how much bigger our business can become. This is how much bigger our brand can become, and the financial side associated with that. So I think there's a rational and a kind of emotional argument that needs to be played out and kind of couched in financial terms to get senior executives on board. Maybe I'd also encourage them to read a book called The Innovators Dilemma by a guy called Clayton Christensen, that talks about how industries are disrupted from the bottom up, and incumbents within industries don't tend to see the disruption until it's too late because they're not looking at the right things. And I think sports has a lot of similar parallels with those industries that are talked about in that book.
Very good. Thank you, Sam. All right. I think in the interest of letting everyone out on time, and with just the remaining minute that we have together, I want to flag and let you all know that we're going to send each person that joined us today a PDF reports with all the key slides and figures that we've gone through today. So you'll be getting that in the next day or two. If you want anything more, if you want to keep this conversation going with us or talk about our research in any detail, please don't hesitate to reach out to any member of the team. And we would love and look forward to speaking with you. So thank you again on behalf of the team, Sam, Laura, and everyone at Two Circles. Thank you for joining us, and we wish you a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.